Next, let's head over to the cattle side of the ag industry. And there's a term out there called Heifer Harmony used when heifers are not retained for breeding purposes and instead sent to a feedlot. If you find yourself in that situation, there's some specific things you want to have on your mind and consider for this time of the year. Bill Dodd is standing by with this story. Bill?
Since 2020, the United States cow-calf population has declined roughly 10%. That means fewer heifers are being retained within cow-calf operations and making their way to feedlot operations. With that in mind, there are some steps feedlot operators can take to ensure the biggest bang for their buck when it comes to feeding and caring for these new arrivals.
Starting in January, we were seeing heifer feedlot numbers, total cattle on feed percent, at around 39.7 to 40% rate. And that number was extremely high, where we see our normal heifer in a feedlot rate at around 37%. However, we are getting an inkling right now that maybe there is a little bit more heifer retention into those cow-calf operations or used for breeding, as we have seen a decline in the number of heifers in the feedlot down to about 38.5% of total cattle on feed. And so this is positive for us in terms of rebuilding the cow herd, but also we're seeing historically high prices in both feeder calf and fat cattle pricing, where we actually last week saw an inverted steer to heifer pricing ratio for dressed cattle. And we don't ever normally see that. Steers are always much higher than heifers in terms of live fat cattle prices and dressed beef, but we did see this.
A major factor to take into account when receiving new heifers in a feedlot operation is potential pregnancy. In fact, roughly 2 to 15% of new heifers will arrive on a feedlot already pregnant. With that in mind, there are a few options when it comes to checking for and handling a pregnant heifer.
And so one of our best standard operating procedures that we can recommend is palpating those cattle upon arrival. So that can be by rectal palpation or by blood test, etc. Getting your vet out there to, assist you in that procedure and make sure that those heifers are not pregnant upon arriving into the feed yard. Another factor of that is if that animal is pregnant in the feed yard, now what do you do with that heifer, right? Do you remove her from the feeding system altogether and maybe sell her as a bred animal, or are you going to deal with that pregnancy in terms of utilizing an abortifacient? And that's always a conversation that we encourage you to have with your veterinarian because abortifacient and their use are based largely on age of the heifer and weight of that heifer in the feed yard. One thing is that some guys will maybe consider just feeding that heifer out. Maybe she's not going to calve before she makes her way to the packing plant. We don't highly recommend that because overall the heifers that are bred are just not going to perform the same as females in the feed yard that are, obviously intact but without calf.
Mixing pens with heifers and steers is something that should also be avoided. When taking heifers into a feedlot operation, keeping them separate from the steer population is a necessary step for several reasons. However, the type of nutrition needed by steers will differ greatly from the needs of the heifers.
So mixed pens, I guess our number one challenge is in order to suppress estrus in our heifer population in the feed yard, we use a type A medicated feed called melangestrol acetate. Fed at a pretty low dose rate in the feed yard sector, but we do feed it to the majority of the heifer population in feed yards because it does suppress estrus. And, a lot of people think that we're trying to suppress estrus and, not allow that heifer to get bred, etc. But really the value is that the feed conversion and overall hot carcass weight advantage or rate of gain advantage is there when we feed MGA. And so some historical data on that, we see on average an increase of about 19 pounds of hot carcass weight by feeding MGA to heifers.
With packers seemingly trying to get more beef on the rails, feeding heifers is quite advantageous considering the current prices of fat cattle. However, success will hinge on good management strategies and the standard operating procedures within the feedlot operation itself. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.